Hello out there in all the digital land. Happy Wednesday to you. Today we're going to talk specifically about family. And it might be appropriate to discuss family today because a lot of us have been spending a lot of time with family, a time we didn't know we were going to be spending at this level of intensity as recently as about, what, 5 weeks ago? And so we learn a lot about each other in family. We learn how to do life together in family. We learn important lessons about family as well and what it means to us. And there's a lot of fun and a lot of function and often dysfunction in families. And I think that's okay because at our core, we are all dysfunctional at a level that needs healing. And so today we're going to talk about Jesus's family a bit, and it's in the context of Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 21 and verses 31 through 35. Now, that second section, 31 through 35, cap off chapter 3. And in the middle is another intense engagement, but this is with the religious leaders. So, what I've chosen to do is look at the brackets of Jesus's engagement with family, 20 through 21, and then 31 through 35, and we're going to save that portion from 22 to 30 for tomorrow because it's an important conversation as well. But in this entire section, literally reaching back into the close of yesterday's section where Jesus chose his posse, we see in verse 19 that the last person Jesus chose, at least the last one listed in Mark's roster, is Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So, what we see in this narrative from that description of Judas and his behavior to the end of chapter 3, which is verse 35. So, from 19 through 35, we see that Jesus is betrayed by a friend. Now, that will happen in the arrest and crucifixion narrative. And then he's declared insane by his family. And then also he is declared possessed by Satan by the authorities of the day. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a lot for one person to burden. Being betrayed by a friend, and Jesus knew this roster and its makeup, being declared insane by your family, and being declared possessed by the authorities who were to be experts in such matters of supernatural warfare and possession. And so, what we see here is Jesus is taking on this mission with an increasing level of burden and danger. And really, the word is risk. And that's kind of the question. That's the key word for today is risk and where we are in our walk with Jesus. And so let's just get into it here. In Matthew 10, Jesus is talking about family as well. And he says at the close of a dialogue about how we are to see our life with Jesus compared to the competitive callings of the other relationships of our lives. Jesus says when we are doing life the way he is calling us to do it, there's going to be difficulty. There's going to be division. There'll be lines in the sand. And Jesus says this about following him. A person's foes will be those even of his own household. And that's not a comfortable thought at all, is it? And it deserves some attention. So let's look at this text here. I'm going to read as if it's a continuing narrative. I'm going to read 20, 21, and then go right to 31 through 35 because it's all enclosed, encased action. Mark 3, verse 20. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered. We see this as a regular theme. The crowd gathered so thickly that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. There was such a crowd that they were pressing in. The text literally says that they couldn't take bread. So this is a compact, this is like sardines of humanity wanting Jesus to help them, heal them. They want to learn from him, this crowd. And when his family heard about this, they went to seize him. The text literally says they went to take domination over him. They went to grasp control of him. They went to seize him. For they said, he is outside his mind. That's the literal statement in the original language. He has taken leave outside of himself. He's no longer in his rightful person. He is standing outside of who he is. So his family heard about this, and maybe it was the last straw. They'd been exposed to Jesus's uh, legacy and legend, even at mythical proportions, growing in the northern regions of Israel around his own hometown. And this was maybe the last straw. And so mothers and brothers go to take control of him because he is clearly outside his mind. And we're going to examine really their probable good reasons, at least from a horizontal perspective, of thinking that he needs to be rescued even from himself. Verse 31, then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Now, we don't see Joseph in the picture. It's interesting that we don't see Joseph really at all after the return from Egypt in the early chapters of Matthew, when Joseph is warned to flee from Herod into Egypt, and then when Herod dies, he's called to return with his family. We don't really see him in the narrative at all. So Jesus' mother and brothers arrived at this house. Standing outside because they couldn't get in, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. That's not strong enough a word. The word is literally seeking you with intensity. What's going on here is they sent someone in to say, you come out here right now, young man. Your mother and brothers are outside seeking you, demanding you. And Jesus answers with a question. An interesting question, because at first it just seems an easy biological answer, a familial answer. Who are my mother and my brothers, he asked. And then he looked around at those seated in a circle around him, probably mostly this posse that we saw who was chosen in our section yesterday. He looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. So what he's saying is, this is the deeper family. There's deeper connection. There's deeper affinity about life's purpose. There is a deeper sense of mission as to the use of our lives. He says, whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. Now, Jesus says this in several ways in the four stories about him, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he even uses at times the hate word in the sense of choosing your primary love and your primary mission. And so this is the first time we see this in the narrative of any of the four Gospels, any of the four stories, where Jesus is drawing this line in the sand about what it means for him to be deeply connected in family. You see, his own family had come to the conclusion that Jesus had taken leave of his senses and that it was time that he be taken home for his own good. But Jesus said there's a deeper thing going on. There's a broader thing. There's a richer thing. There's something that must be grasped outside of the typical understanding of what it means to be in a family, to do family, and set goals for the individuals in the family. Why don't we see if we can examine, I've taken some notes on giving Jesus' mother and brothers the benefit of the doubt, and I think you'll relate to them because they are common to every human being, and particularly for those of us who are parents. These are values we want to overlay into our children in a way that may or may not be representative of the mission that Jesus has called us to. So let's see if we can understand together what might have made Jesus' family, his mother and his brothers, be so insistent that he be rescued from his current path. And I've just taken some notes here, and I'm going to read uh, literally just read. So, by his actions, Jesus had made it clear that the three organizing principles around which most people build their lives meant absolutely nothing to him. Because as we've seen throughout the story, there are three organizing principles that Jesus had no regard for when it came to comparing those principles to his calling. And the first organizing principle that he had discarded was the need for security. And this is the one thing that most people in the world want more than anything else is to be secure, to be comfortable, to make sure that we have enough provision, that we have the right place, that we have the right job, that we have the right retirement. Now, this is mostly a Western thing, but it speaks to that deep craving to know that we are taken care of, that we are going to have what we need either through our work or our education, or both our work and our education, and our network of possibilities and the way we see ourselves progressing up the ladder of material security and provision. But Jesus had no regard for that. You see, he left the business in Nazareth. He left the family business. And by all accounts, it was a business that would have provided his needs, his carpenter craftsman business. And he could at least made a living. And all of a sudden, I mean, it seems like a 180 to his family that he had just left that. And I don't know how many projects were left undone when he went and made his way to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. But he made a choice to rid himself of the need for security. He went literally from an earner to a vagrant in his family's eyes. And so that's the first organizing principle that he discarded. And the second organizing principle that he discarded was personal safety. Most of us at all times tend to play it safe. We have this need for self preservation. And so when we choose a course of action, we automatically choose whether or not it's going to be safe and whether or not we will be preserved through it. And most of us are risk averse. But Jesus, in this sense, had set aside his need for personal safety. And that's obvious if you look at the conflicts with the religious leaders, the authorities, who had these rules in place that if they were violated, a death sentence could be pronounced right quick and in a hurry. Uh, Jesus was literally on the way, and his family saw this. He was on the way to a head on collision to the leaders of his day who, by their own proclamation, could bring down the guillotine of judgment. The opposition was clear, the danger was palpable. And to them, no sensible man would ever go against the powers that be. It's just not safe. And so Jesus had discarded security as an organizing principle of his life, and he had discarded safety as an organizing principle of his life. And the third principle that most of us live according to is that Jesus showed himself, what I would say, he showed himself utterly indifferent. Now, this is a term that I came upon a while back, and I really like it. Jesus had shown himself utterly indifferent to the verdict of society. Most of us live our lives desiring the people around us to say nice things about us. We like to be spoken well of. We like to be affirmed. And so we organize our lives and our statements and our behavior around whether or not we're going to receive affirmation. And in a way that's not so positive, we call that people pleasing. But Jesus had shown himself utterly indifferent, uncaring, callous maybe when compared to his mission. Utterly indifferent to the verdict of society. He didn't care what people said about him. There was only one whose affirmation he sought. Because Jesus had started this little posse of his own, this odd little posse. They were fishermen. One was a reformed tax collector, Levi, Matthew, who was on this side of the spectrum, hated by the Jews. And then there was a fanatical nationalist, Simon the Zealot, who would have hated Levi as a tax collector, a Jew that has betrayed his own people. They were certainly not the kind of people who would do any good to a man who was set on a positive verdict of society. So we see that Jesus' family, if we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, they were terrified because it seemed like almost overnight Jesus had thrown away the basic organizing principles around which most of us center our lives. Now, isn't that true? Aren't most of us predisposed to security and safety and being well spoken of? And is it maybe true that to center our lives there, if we say we know, love, and follow Jesus and want to do God's will, that those principles might interfere with a courageous expression of Jesus' life through us? You know, I've come across this many times in my life. And Sherry and I have stories for sure. And not because I'm a pastor and she's my wife. She's not. It's not because I'm a pastor and she's a pastor's wife. It's because we have to choose daily whether or not we are going to center on the organizing principles of the world or center on the calling that Jesus has given us. And I remember when I came to faith, when I was literally compelled to faith, I was in the business world. I was in a position of power and influence. And, you know, I had people who, when I said do, they did, or they died, vocationally speaking. But when I came to faith, there's just this thing that began to change, and I was less and less interested in the organizing principles of this world, and it began to create a line in the sand. People in my life, the people that worked for me, the people that were my friends, they began to not want to have anything to do with me, and so the verdict of society in my inner circle was less and less of Mitch is a great guy to Mitch is a weirdo. And I had to choose regularly. Every time I walked into the office, every time I went into a meeting, every time I had a choice to use honest scales in my business life or to maybe go the way of the world and to tweak the scales a bit in my favor. And my wife as well has had this same need, like all of us do, to decide whether or not on a daily basis we are going to live according to the organizing principles of the world, or we're going to be betrayed or deemed insane or even deemed possessed by someone other than the Holy Spirit. I remember when one of our twin boys, Jordan, who had like a 180 experience of his own in high school, uh, he asked me to talk, and I can still see it. We're in our den, and I can see him in that chair, and I'm in my chair. And he said, Dad, I think, I think I want to go into ministry. I think I want to be a pastor. And I think he expected me to like pull out the champagne and pop the cork. It was the exact opposite because of what I know and what Sherry knows, what we've learned together about what it means to continue to choose the organizing principles of the kingdom, which is risk accepting toward the life of Christ in all areas. Uh, and so I think he saw my face fall. Uh, and I said, you sure about this? I said, you'd be a great coach. You'd be a great this. You'd be a great that. And isn't that the way it is with our kids? We tend to organize our kids' lives around what the world wants from them, what we want from them. We want them to have the right education so they can get the right job and have the right security and be safe and be well spoken of. But that is not my role as the parent of a kid, son, or daughter who's following Jesus. And it's such a struggle. And ultimately, with Jordan, you know, we agreed, because I wanted him to, we agreed to pray about it together and individually for a month and then have a comeback conversation. And a month later, he's like, no, I'm firm, Dad. I'm like, well, if you're firm, let's go. And right now, he is, I'm proud of him. He's an intern at a young church down in the South Austin area. And he's learning these things about what it means to organize around kingdom principles and to experience the betrayal and the being labeled as insane or even being labeled as possessed by something and someone other than the Holy Spirit. Is that a goal of yours? What is your story? For those of us who follow Jesus, it has to be less and less about defaulting to the organizing principles of the world, and more and more about risking it for the kingdom, which is really weird. I say risk, and because I'm talking about it from a horizontal human perspective. But when I'm obedient to do God's will, there's no risk at all. The risk is actually in not being obedient and in continuing to live in the counterfeit security, safety, and affirmation of everything temporary. What is your story? I don't know if you know, I'm going to close with this. Uh, this is an example of someone who continually made the decision to organize around kingdom principles. His name was John Bunyan. He lived in the 1600s, and he wrote what's widely accepted to be the first English novel, The Pilgrim's Progress. Have you read it? I've read it a few times. It's an amazing work. Now you have to deal with the language of the 1600s, which is kind of cool anyway because it's just so flamboyant. But Bunyan went to prison several times. Now, how many times he went is not known. But he was constantly being labeled as insane for his beliefs and his insistence that people who follow Christ should organize around kingdom principles and not the organizing principles of the world. And he was persecuted even by his own household. And he was in prison one time, and it might have ended for him in hanging, in the gallows, if the verdict went the wrong way. And this is what he said when he was thinking about his imprisonment and possibly being hanged by men. I hope I'm still broadcasting because we just had a power surge because the storm is out there. I'm going to keep on like we are. John Bunyan was in prison. He was afraid, which is natural. My imprisonment, he thought, might end on the gallows for aught that I knew. He didn't like the thought of being hanged. And then came the day that he was actually ashamed of being afraid of being hanged. And this is so interesting. Methought, he said, remember, we're in the 1600s, methought I was ashamed to die with a pale face and tottering knees for such a cause as kingdom advancement. So finally, he came to the conclusion when he thought of himself climbing up the ladder to the hangman's scaffold. Wherefore, just listen. Wherefore, thought I am going on and venturing into my eternal state with Christ, whether I have comfort here or no. If God doth not invade and save me, thought I, then I will leap off the ladder, even blindfolded, into eternity, sink or swim, come heaven, come hell. And then his prayer, Lord Jesus, if thou wilt catch me, do. If not, I will venture for thy name. Now, this is a man following Jesus. This is a man eschewing the organizing principles of security, safety, and reputation of the world, and desiring only to leap into the arms of Jesus, knowing that even if he doesn't catch him here, he's already caught and secure for eternity. Don't you love that? You ought to read The Pilgrim's Progress. So that's going to be it for today. I hope this has been refreshing. Remember, Jesus calls us with a line in the sand to scrape kingdom principles aside and give it all for the principles of his kingdom. Peace.